What up, guys? Welcome to Q&A number 6. I remember when we were on number 1 and you guys were still in diapers, and now you're 6 years old, or number 6, whatever. Anyway, we're on Q&A number 6. In case you are new here, or even if you're not new here and you forgot, how these work is I answer your questions. So if you have a question, something that's keeping you up at night about muscle building, don't ask me other complicated stuff. I'm good for one thing: muscle building, and that is it. Outside of that, I am completely useless. I'm a barely functioning adult. But if you have a question, muscle related, get down in the comments, ask it down there, and look at some of your fellow YouTubers' questions. If you hear or you read another question that sounds good and you think I would like to know the answer to that, give it a little thumbs up. And then once you guys are all done, I'll come and look at them in a week or so, and I will pick the top 10 most thumbed up, 10, 8, 12, somewhere around there, thumbed up. I don't know if that's a verb. I'm making it a verb. Thumbed up questions. And those will be the ones that I answer when we come around through number 7. So off of number 5, this is where we're at. These are the top. I think I'm doing, again, 9 or 10 questions here or so. And the first couple were definitive. A lot of people want to hear the answers to this. So getting right into it, Scott asked the question basically saying, how important is training to failure? Is it necessary for maximum muscle growth? Or could you basically have the same benefits, staying 1 or 2 reps or 3 reps short of failure, or reps and reserve, as the kids are saying these days? So the short answer is I think this is one of those variables. It's another good variable that I think it's actually nice that people are paying attention to it now, because back in the day, people didn't pay attention to this variable a whole lot. Everybody was just reps and sets. People then, especially around Paulquin time, got a little bit more concerned with tempo. People look at rest time. People look at total volume, weekly volume. All that stuff is good. And now people are starting to look at proximity to failure as well, too, as another variable. Like any variable, I think it just needs to be individual dependent. So the short answer is, when you're new, I don't think you need to train to failure. I could argue that maybe you shouldn't, but more importantly, you don't need to. And I think in theory, now again, because everyone is so different, everyone's recovery is different, the way everyone progresses is different, at some point in time, I think almost everyone, if you want to take your physique as far as possible, will need to train to failure. So very beginning, don't need to train to failure. At some point in time, I think everyone will need to train to failure. When that time frame is, again, that's the individual part I was starting to get to, is just going to be different from person to person. How do you know when you should start training to failure? That's the $1 million question, because just like anything that people like to get online and argue about all day long is people want to argue about this one specific variable. Should I rest 1 minute or 90 seconds? Should I rest 90 seconds or 2 minutes? Should I do 3 working sets or should I do 4 working sets? Should I do this split or that split? And the reality is, I think people put so much time and effort into arguing about those very specific things, yet their adherence is so piss poor that you wouldn't even know if one change of one variable is actually making a difference, right? I made this analogy before where most people basically are just taking a blender. If you want to look at your entire trending, your entire training, whole deal, whatever you want to call it. So your breakdown, your stimulus in the gym, your recovery, and am I growing muscle? This is everything that goes into building muscle and putting on muscle. We're taking all these things that are just random amounts, not measured, not tracked, inconsistent, and we're putting them all in a blender and we're just blending it all up. And then people want to know, okay, well, if I add one little drop of this, will that be the reason that this whole thing has this outcome that tastes like this? Well, is it this one little drop that you put in, or is it these 47 other ingredients at unmeasured amounts that are different every single time you blend the whole smoothie together? That may or may not be a good analogy. I'm going to say it's good because I said it. But so that's the thing that's silly about all this kind of stuff that, again, I'm getting off track with talking about training to failure, is it's really tough for a lot of people to know, would this one variable being changed make a difference if every single thing within your training is all moving parts and it's not measured? So really the question is, you're going to have to actually do your stuff consistently enough and accurately enough and adhere to it well enough that you would think, okay, this might be one variable I want to try. So you'd have to have everything consistent with your recovery, with everything else about your training, and you get to a point where your training seems to start to stall. You've been training for 3 or 4 or 5 years consistently. You're log booking things, you're progressing things, you're tracking your diet, you're on top of your sleep, you're on top of your recovery, and things just start to slow down. And again, it could be slowing down a little bit as a result of your training age, but then you could say, okay, well, maybe I've been staying for a long period of time, 1 or 2 reps short of failure. Maybe I will try training to failure. And if you keep every other variable consistent, you try training to failure and you kind of kickstart your progress again, then that might obviously be a good indication that training to failure is a good idea for you. But the reality is most people aren't even consistent enough to really know if that is the thing they need to do to progress. And the last thing I'll say on that question before the kind of ramble, which hopefully you guys gain some value from rambling, if you're watching this for the first time and you want me to just answer things as yes or no, go to someone else on YouTube because I'm not that guy. I like to try and have as much context as possible. So again, when thousands of people are watching the same video, you could potentially have thousands of different actionable things that you can do instead of just saying yes or no. That's not going to help too many people. So I'm a big advocate of always, you guys have probably heard me say this a bunch of times, as little as possible to produce maximal results. So I train a bunch of normal people. I train my wife weekly. 90% of the time, even for how long she's been training, I don't really need to take her to failure. Her limiting factor is pretty much always recovery. So for her, her programming is a little bit more total body, it's higher frequency, and generally always short of failure because we can make progress with that. And again, anytime you have more stimulus, you will also require more recovery. So again, that's the argument for why would a beginner train to failure if what they're doing is enough for them to keep growing. And then all of a sudden, if you say, well, I'm going to train to failure because it's fun, that might be okay. You might not have to do that, but it also might exceed your current recovery, right? So that's one thing for sure. All other things on paper being the same. If you stay 2 reps short of failure or go to failure, going to failure is more taxing on recovery. That doesn't mean it's bad. Now, people take that out of context as well, too, and say, well, you don't need to train to failure because it's more taxing on recovery, as if that's a reason not to do something. I also use that example where all other things being the same, doing a set of 10 with a 50-pound dumbbell is more taxing than doing a set of 10 with a 40-pound dumbbell. You wouldn't use the same argument of saying, well, you shouldn't use 50-pound dumbbells then because it's more taxing on recovery. Yeah, well, no shit, it's more taxing on recovery, but also that more stimulus is necessary for someone to grow. They're not getting the same out of 40 for 10, so they have to go to 50 for 10. And so again, that's probably the most simple analogy I could use as well too. It's just like going from 50 to 10 is more than 40 to 10. It's necessary for someone at some point in time. That's kind of the same way I look at failure. It's the same as just another number on paper. And it's another variable that at some point in time, I think everyone is going to have to progress, with rare exceptions, because there's some people that have stood on the Olympia stage without ever really training to failure, in my opinion. So if you're a unicorn, like most things, genetics and obviously additional supplements, PEDs can make a change for that as well too. But most normal people at some point in time are going to have to train to failure to keep progressing. Again, the tough part, and for the whole side ramble there, is you really have to be consistent and accurate to know, is that the stimulus variable that is actually keeping you from progressing when you're starting to slow down? Next question, when do you determine when to do unilateral or bilateral exercises? So for me, I'll get into maybe a couple of the outliers, but the short answer is I will always go to bilateral, always, if it is basically a good option for joint mechanics. So the only reason now that I ever use single anything is if I can't make both at the same time line up well. So meaning the reason that I don't do, preacher curls with a fixed bar on a preacher bench is because every single time I do, I can't get my upper arms to not flail out, flame. I don't know, something. Trevor can't think of the word either. There's some good word there. I can't. Flare. A flare, yeah, flare. All right, so I can't keep my arms from flaring out. And so that's the whole reason that I do single arm dumbbell preacher curls, is because when I do both at the same time, it doesn't line up. But I tell everybody in videos where if you're kind of a smaller person, you can get them jammed in, do bilateral just because it takes half as much time. And that honestly, for training economy, is an important thing. If you can have something get done faster, in my opinion, that's always a good option. So I always choose bilateral movements when joint mechanics allow. Whenever you see me doing single arm stuff or lots of cable stuff, like why do I do cable tricep extensions as opposed to skull crushers? I would love to do skull crushers instead because it's so much faster and so much easier to set up, but I just can't make it line up with my body. So for most people, I don't think there is a big advantage to do single anything for the goal of hypertrophy. That being said, there's a bunch of outlier reasons. Maybe if you're coming off of an injury, or if you have a harder time maybe feeling one side than the other. I don't like to play the whole balance game because most people say, oh, I've got this arm smaller than the other arm or whatever it is. Most of that stuff is just kind of, I don't want to say genetic, but it's kind of predetermined by the fact that you are one-sided, you've lived one-sided your entire life. So everyone is going to have a certain amount of asymmetry. And that's on the Olympia stage. I would almost guarantee there's not a single guy whose arms are within an inch of each other, whose legs are within an inch or two of each other if you look at their thighs. So I think chasing symmetry by doing a lot of bilateral work is also generally not the thing that would actually fix the problem. The thing that would fix the problem would be to start living your life in a mirror image of how you've lived it up to this point. That might fix it 10 or 20 years from now. So The short answer is I like to do a lot of unilateral stuff only with the goal of really adhering to joint mechanics, not wrecking my joints where I can't make both at the same time finish. And then, of course, there's some arguments for other stuff. There's certain movements that obviously you really can't do both legged or both legs or both arms or whatever at the same time, particularly legs. Obviously, a split squat isn't a split squat if you do both at the same time, because then it's just a squat, right? Or something else weird. If you're trying to do both legs back, you're doing some weirdo exercise. I don't even know what that would look like. And I think there could be arguably some merit for single leg stuff for the reason that obviously it has different requirements or different demands on your hips. But that's kind of a whole different question. So again, there's in no way, shape, or form am I saying unilateral on whether arms or legs is bad. But from a purely muscle building standpoint, the 90% of the time, 95% of the time, bilateral stuff, I think is the way to go just for training economy. If it fits, if it adheres to a joint mechanics. And again, with maybe that 5% of the time, the rare exception is, yeah, obviously I like to do some single leg stuff, particularly, again, more for semantic reasons. But if I'm trying to maybe create some different demands specifically around my hip, or by doing single leg stuff, sometimes you can allow a joint to get in a different position that it couldn't doing both at the same time. What's my opinion on rest time between sets? In general, so part of this I'll give, I think there's a whole lot of evidence from smart people as well as in the trenches. For your big movements, the stuff that you're intentionally tracking, logbooking, and progressing from week to week, you want to take, relatively speaking, long rest. You don't want cardio to be your limiting factor, and you don't want impatience to be your limiting factor. I mean, there's been times where I just like to get in the gym and move. To some degree, you could argue you maybe get a better pump by moving a little bit quicker with a little shorter rest. But the things that allow for the highest level of force production, and especially to progress those amounts consistently week to week, I think longer rest times are key. So if I'm putting a number on it, most of your bigger stuff, 2 to 3 minutes. There can be times, in my opinion, if you're really doing something brutal, maybe a squat pattern, maybe a deadlift pattern, even upwards of 3-4 minutes, really just kind of until you've caught your breath. And when you're getting into those top sets, the only thing that's going to be the limiting factor, again, for a big movement is either going to be actual muscular failure or form failure. You don't want your lungs to necessarily give out first. That being said, for smaller body parts, obviously you're going to have a slightly different number. So I think you could obviously have a little bit of a shorter period of time for just some of the same things. So obviously if you're doing rear delts or something, you're probably less likely to have your lungs cardio be the limiting factor. But that's really the biggest thing. It's basically what lets you have the highest level of performance, something that you can have the highest level of output, basically on paper, logbook, and progress from week to week. The second part of the question is when you do chest, or you're doing a push, chest, shoulders, and triceps, do you basically do them in that order, or do you alternate? For something like that where you're having similar muscle groups that are involved in all the movements, I recommend going chest, then shoulders, then triceps, just for the reason that in theory, one going back and forth, I think there's an actual basically just kind of that mind muscle connection thing. I know that's kind of vague and non-specific, but there is something, especially depending on where you're at in your training journey, where yes, most of the time putting your body in the right position should be your main focus, but there is something to actually learning how to actually feel and contract muscles as well too, as long as you're not overly obsessed with that. And so lots of times if you alternate it from chest, then to shoulders, chest, then to triceps, sometimes that can just be tough, especially for a newbie, to actually really feel and focus on the trained muscle, especially for something like delts and chest, where basically on almost all chest movements, your delts are always working. So again, for some people, they really have to work hard to get in the good positions to actually feel the chest. So if you were doing alternating between shoulders and chest stuff, it might take away from your output from chest, not even just from a pure fatigue standpoint, but also from a focus standpoint. So the first thing is, again, that kind of non-quantitative, just general mind-muscle connection thing. I think that can be distracting for some people. And then even as you get more advanced, and maybe that's not hard, you could jump in back and forth from exercises, put yourself in the right positions and really feel the trained muscle. There is something where you could have the limiting factor be, again, if you started with triceps and your main goal isn't to bring up triceps and then move to chest, you could have your triceps fatigue before your chest does. So again, from a newbie standpoint, I think there's some reasons, and also from an advanced standpoint, I think there's some reasons as well too, where if you wanted to do more of a superset structure, I just think maybe you would set up with body parts that basically aren't being used as much, during the bigger movements. So you could basically superset back or biceps, something like that. Like chest and biceps or chest and back or something like that, as opposed to something that's basically involved in the same patterns. Long question here for this next one. But the short version is someone has gone through a huge weight loss journey, which is awesome. So he basically went from 235 pounds to 175 pounds over the course of the year. And he's basically 10 pounds away from his goal. And his calories are very, very low. So what should I do is his question. Being that his calories are so low, should he basically drop them again and try and push through to that extra 10 pounds? or should he do something different? In my opinion, if you were my, there's a lot to look at here. So some of it would be great to have a look at your blood work, see how things are doing, maybe have some more detail, obviously, than this question, just depending on how you're feeling, how your energy level is. And again, blood work would be big on this as well, too. Would want to know, are some things maybe not going in the direction you would want them to go in? But even without all that, I would personally say I think you would probably benefit from a little bit of a diet break. And again, that's the thing where you are dieting for way too long, in a deficit for way too long. And again, this isn't just my opinion, but you can show hormonally some things start to go. I hate to use the word starvation mode, but I think I'll use it just because people know what I'm talking about, the phrase starvation mode. Again, as your body says, wow, this is the calories of what we're going to be getting. As you stay in a deficit for a long period of time, your body can start to make some adjustments, because it's really worried about, if we really stay in deficit for forever, eventually we're going to die. So if you can make some adjustments hormonally, your body could potentially preserve itself for a longer period of time. And again, that is a very real thing, and that can be shown with blood work pretty easily, where it was maybe at the start, middle, or, after months and months and months of dieting. So it can be beneficial to have a diet break for physiological reasons, and also for mental and emotional reasons as well, too. So the thing that I would do is just do something very structured. I would personally maybe start going into maintenance first, and then maybe actually go into a period of time of a little bit of a surplus. And then from there, potentially go right back into a deficit again. I hate to put timeframes on this, because some of this is based a lot on your feedback. It would be based a lot on your blood work, but maybe you could do, to start, just to ease into it, a few weeks at what you think your maintenance is. And then maybe, and so saying maybe like 3 weeks, and then maybe another 3 weeks or so in a little bit of a surplus. And the nice part is, while you're doing this, if you set your structure out ahead of time, maybe you want to do your due diligence, get a little blood work done as well too, then it's not something where you really have to think like, oh my gosh, am I going to be in the surplus forever? And you start to freak out thinking like, if the scale does start to go up, which it probably wouldn't, obviously, in maintenance and first, and might not even do it when you're actually in a legit surplus, at least for a few weeks. But if it does start to go up, you could shift your goals of saying, okay, I'm going to do this for this many weeks, then this many weeks. And then at the same time, you could shift your goals to actually putting on a little bit more muscle. And so, okay, I'm going to use this time to actually put on a little bit more muscle. And then when you come out the other side, let's say 6 weeks down the road, arguably you're going to have more muscle, hormonally be in a better spot, and then be right back where those last 10 pounds of body fat should probably come off a lot easier, and a lot healthier, and most importantly, a lot more sustainable. So there's a lot more detail I could go into that question. I always recommend with people, it's really good to work with someone that's very good with diet, that maybe wants to see your blood work as well too, that's qualified to do so, because again, you could definitely go through that with a little bit more of a structured manner. But I think that's some general decent advice that's not going to mess you up, and probably should be beneficial. This is a good question. I have mixed feelings about this. Hey coach, I get the feeling your arms were terrible at one time or another. Could you sum up some basic approach to how to attack arms? Well, at least you're not saying they're terrible now. I did joke, that is my thing, is that they were terrible and now they're slightly less terrible, which is really the goal for people that maybe genetically don't have the best, the best genetics for arms. And I do have these long old monkey arms. But yeah, so honestly, the things that always work best for me, so there is kind of the default that needs to basically be stated for every single body part, where how you're doing things is always the most important, right? So before we look at the on paper stuff, if it was just as easy as do more, people generally wouldn't have lagging body parts, right? So because it's really easy to say, oh, I'm doing this, well, just double it, and there you go, you're going to have a big body part. And again, that's not the case. So you really need to address your form first. If your arms aren't growing, again, you really can't blame genetics if they're not growing. You can blame genetics if maybe they're not growing at the same rate as other things, or if you just have longer limbs, they might technically be growing at the same pace as other things, but it just takes longer to basically aesthetically, visually fill out a longer limb than it does for a shorter limb. Make sure first and foremost, it's not form, it's not execution, it's not potentially even intensity, where it's, again, some people, their form and all that execution just goes to shit for the reps that matter. So once you address that, I do think that arms do respond better to a little bit more higher frequency, or they can. One, it's just a smaller body part. So anytime you have a smaller body part, you don't have to worry as much about this whole systemic thing. So someone says, oh, I want to bring up legs, and you want to squat 3 times a week. Well, depending on how you're squatting 3 times a week, that's a lot of systemic stuff that might just be tough for your body to recover from just that big of a movement. Where training biceps 3 times a week, yeah, you still need to be worried about the recovery from that individual muscle itself. Is there muscle damage occurring? You want to make sure it has time to repair, all that good stuff. But it's not going to have to be this whole systemic thing, right? No one's ever really done biceps really hard 3 times a week, and they feel like they've gotten hit by a truck and they're just tired and can't wake up. Where if you do legs 3 times a week very hard, you can literally feel like you're just, borderline non-functional. So I always had the best results with arms when I would train biceps 3 times a week, and I would do triceps twice a week. Triceps, one, I could argue, just exclusive of everything else, don't recover quite as well as biceps. And then arguably they're involved a little bit more because you have chest and you have shoulders generally having pressing movements, where generally if you're doing bicep stuff, the only other time you have to worry about that is with back pulling type movements. And then from there, I always say most people do way too many exercises. So if you're going to have higher frequency stuff, I have higher frequency stuff of the stuff that feels great. That's also a big thing on that as well too, is if you just go and blast, I'm not saying straight arm barbell curls. Let's say it for me, straight barbell, curls just wreck my elbows. So if I was trying to do a movement like that 3 times a week, then basically it's just I'm going to get 3 times as fast to wrecked elbows. So it becomes even more important that you have movements that fit really well, adhere to your joint mechanics of your elbows, and allow you to train them at higher frequency without having orthopedic issues sneak up on you. So for me, it ends up being a relatively short list of exercises, right? I don't have 10 different bicep movements that are great, that fit awesome. I have a couple different options for single arm preacher curls, cable curls, things like that. So for me, typically it looked like a lot of the same movements repeated. And especially when we're talking triceps, a lot of isolation movements repeated as well too that fit perfect. So if I have a cable variation that fits great, I'd rather do that twice a week for triceps, as opposed to also considering, again, when we're saying a smaller muscle group, not doing as many compound movements as frequency. So if I'm trying to have hit my triceps twice a week, one of them I might have a compound movement like a close grip press variation, jam press variation, dip variation, but I probably wouldn't do that for both sessions, again, because that's a little bit more to recover from. So I have a higher frequency of isolation movements, but they also have to just fit perfect. So typically if I'm doing triceps twice a week, maybe 2, but might have one workout that's a little bit bigger, might have a compound movement and 2 isolation movements, and then the second one would probably only have 2 isolation movements. And then for biceps, if I'm doing them 3 times a week, I might only have 2 movements per workout, and one of them could be tagged onto a pull day, and one of them could be on its own day as well too. And that's typically how I've always done that, is if I'm doing triceps, let's say twice a week, one of them is with a push day, and one of them might be on the arm day. And same thing with biceps. I might have an arm day, just biceps and triceps, and then I might have 2 other biceps just tagged on wherever, tagged onto a pull day or tagged on tech leave to a push day, shoulder day, wherever you can kind of stick them wherever. So that's kind of what it would look like for me any times that I've been able to actually bring up my arms. And that always works really well. Like I said, I don't feel like I have the best genetics structurally for arms either, but I've never had an issue with actually getting them to grow. It just seems like half of it, I would argue, have better genetics for things like quads. But again, it's that limb thing. I have shorter femurs. So half of it is just X amount of muscle looks bigger on a shorter femur than someone with a longer femur. Same thing with arms. Even though I'm putting on muscle, it's just more real estate to fill out to actually have that aesthetic thing happen where they look bigger. That's why people that generally have the best arms of all times have these little tiny short arms. It's like Lee Priest, not saying anything negative in any way, shape, or form. His arms are ridiculous, but his upper arm is this long. His forearms are this long. And the same thing can be said about legs. You look at like Tom Platz and some of the best quads of all time, arguably the best quads of all time, best adductors, best hamstrings of all time. His femur is also this long. So again, that's a lot of times where the best of anything is there's going to be a component of genetics and of course work ethic and all that good stuff in there as well too. But visually, it's easier. It's less muscle to fill up a shorter limb than something else. Next question, my views on heavy duty training by Mike Menser. I feel like I've answered this one a lot, but there were a lot of thumbs, so you guys want to know. I like, if I was going to say if I was more of an advocate of lower intensity, lower volume and higher intensity, or higher volume and lower intensity, I'm much more of an advocate of lower volume and higher intensity. So I love a lot of the Mike Menser stuff. Again, for anyone that doesn't know, I always say this, Mike Menser basically got all of his training stuff from Arthur Jones. Arthur Jones is arguably the first person to really pioneer this kind of HIIT style training. And Mike Menser was in some way, shape, or form one of his pupils. Again, I don't really know how much or how consistently he worked with him, but he was one of the first very popular bodybuilders to kind of promote that high intensity style training. And then you'll hear the same thing that from Dorian. Dorian, I think first maybe saw or heard a lot of it from Mike Menser and then basically figured out it was from Arthur Jones and read all of his stuff and modified and made it his own. And I like it for more than anything else. That whole principle, as little as possible to produce maximal results. And then also secondarily, for most people, especially if you want to do this for a long period of time, I think orthopedically volume is the killer. So orthopedically, I mean joints, connective tissue, all that kind of stuff. And volume is the thing that sneaks up on people that are doing bodybuilder style, hypertrophy style training more so than the actual intensity and load you're using. So all other things being the same, I would always rather use as little as volume as possible, just so I can basically be in the game as long as possible. Because I think to some degree, some joints, some things, yes, some connective tissue basically regrows better than others, or I shouldn't even say regrows, but heals better than others. and some things pretty much don't. Cartilage, stuff like that. So once it's gone, it's gone. So yeah, so I love a lot of stuff that came from Arthur Jones, Mike Mentzer, Dorian Yates. Dante is a big advocate of obviously the more of a hit style training, and a lot of people do that kind of stuff these days. And so again, I think the big thing with all that stuff is don't get married to anything. That's why again, I think a lot of people ask me this question because they don't really know what is my style of training. Because I try not to have a style of training. I try and say, okay, well, here's where we're at, and let's just see what gets the job done. But that being said, obviously, I have a lot of things that I've taken from people that came before me, or built upon from people before me, or looked at what worked. Obviously, looking at what produces results in reality in actual human beings training is a very important thing as well too. So yes, I love basically a lot of the stuff that came from that heavy duty style of training. Here's another one. This kind of stems in a similar thought process I touched on with a rant earlier about training to failure. But basically the question is, I think I'm recovering, and then in parentheses saying, I'm not sore when hitting a body part again, but I'm not progressing. Could adding more volume help me progress? The short answer is maybe. The longer answer is I would personally probably look at a lot of other stuff first. So again, if I had somebody walk in the front door and they would say, hey, I want you to be my coach, I want you to train me, and we ask all these questions, and I'm getting some of the same stuff saying, well, I really feel like do I need more of this? I mean, I feel like I'm not ever sore. And, is more volume the answer? The places that I would look, say, all right, well, let's go in and let's see what you're doing. Let's see what you're doing on paper. And then most importantly, let's see what you're doing on the gym floor. I've never actually had someone come in where it was more volume that needed fixing. Normally, it's a lot of the same things that everyone else needs fixing. So the order, I would say, most of the time is work on form and execution. And again, the whole thing about form and execution is it's to make stuff harder. It's to make stuff harder. And I still look at it like a huge difference as I see from newbies, with rare exception. Things just don't, like, you want to look like a robot, and then you want to look like, kind of like, for the most part, like an angry, aggressive robot, so look at the way like Jordan Peters trains or something. And there's other examples, but people that train, like, they literally, their motions are so controlled and so deliberate, and then they can basically ramp up the intensity on top of that, keeping all of that looking controlled and deliberate. And when I look at most beginner to intermediates, it's just stuff is all over the place. Your motions, to me, don't look intentional. And again, all that intentional good form stuff, I always like to use Jordan as an example because he's stronger than you. If you're watching this, he's a lot stronger than you. Odds are, if you're watching this, he's probably like 5 times stronger than you. So again, he's a great example where, again, some people, when I hear me say form, they're just visualizing people just squeezing their little pink dumbbells hard, and that's what I'm saying to grow muscle. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to figure out how to have form that is going to be the most challenging for your muscle, the trained muscle, or the most challenging for the movement that you're choosing. And again, the things that are going to create ultimately the most demand out of what you're trying to grow. So again, I would say probably not volume. It would be form first. And then it would be being able to take that form out for a ride. So again, do the Jordan Peters thing. Are you actually using loads as heavy as you can possibly use? Or depending on where you're at, we asked about training to failure. I would probably say most people need to train closer to failure before we look to add to volume. And someone might be saying, well, I am trained to failure. Again, from what I've seen from people walking in the front door asking me for help, most people train to failure like shit. So they might have good form for the first 5 reps of a 10 rep set to failure. And then as we get past that tipping point, as things get hard and painful, it basically just morphs or changes into a second exercise. People tend to just bail out. I've seen people just quit when I thought they had 3 or 4 reps left in the tank, or they start to bounce, or they just, again, the intention goes out the window when pain starts to send it in at a high level. So I would say most of the time, those would be the things I look at first. Look at form, look at what you're doing with that form, look how far you're taking that form. And then from there, still look at recovery. So once you really take up, like I said, training all of those things, and even by recovery is what are all the stuff outside the box? I mean, I'm going to reference Jordan Peters again, because he says a lot of good stuff. His whole thing is, are you ticking the boxes? And that's the whole thing that I had the rant about training to failure. No one's ticking the boxes. Like, are you eating something consistent? Like, are you actually tracking things that you're doing? Are you sleeping consistent? Are you setting yourself up so when you come into the gym, everything else outside of it is done consistently enough that you know that you're going to have a consistent level of performance into the gym if you're capable of taking things far. So hopefully for all those reasons, you can understand by rarely is adding more volume the thing that's going to help someone. The only time that might be an exception sometimes is with someone super advanced. There have been times, and it's not always even across the board, it might even be for specific body parts, where someone is checking all their boxes, they train with amazing form, they're progressing loads to points where they're ridiculous, they train close to failure, and they do it beautifully. Sometimes I've seen people that need a little bit more volume, but that's generally where I would add it, is the more advanced crowd, maybe And even that's pretty rare, to be honest. Question, what's the best way to build rear delts? Volume, intensity, frequency. Thanks a lot. So all that stuff, first and foremost, the biggest reason people don't grow rear delts is because they're not good at training rear delts. So again, it's just basically, it's a small muscle group. And what I mean by that is it's almost always form is the lacking thing. So it's a small muscle group. It's kind of a small target, and you've got a lot of tissue around it that can do other stuff. So if you look sitting basically right below it, you got a big old teres down there. For some people, that muscle that sits kind of right underneath it can do a very similar motion, very similar function. So one, you got to get good at basically hitting the target first and foremost. And then once you're good at that, then the rest is just kind of similar, like almost like my conversation with arms. Yeah, in general, they can respond better. Delts in general, same as a smaller body part, to slightly higher frequency. Most people I've seen their delts grow really, really well twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week. Like I've trained in the past where certain people, I think delts are more important than other populations. Commonplace, I would say, is figure. So if you look at figure athletes, delts are like worth their weight in gold. So huge round capped delts on a figure competitor are much more important than almost any other body part, because figure is really, not to get on a side tangent if you don't know anything about competing, but figure is really the silhouette the figure competitor creates is much more important than all the little details in. Now that all matters too, especially at the highest level, but you're almost never going to have feedback from a figure competitor about like, oh, they needed more chest, they needed more biceps, something like that. It's always, you look at who's winning, and some of this, of course, is genetic and predetermined, but it's the ones that have the most dramatic V, so like the 2V, so little teeny tiny waist, nice big quad sweep, nice big cap delts. So I use that example because I've had some figure competitors before where, because we weren't training other stuff as hard, we had more recovery to go to other things. And so I've had people in the past train delts 3 times a week as well too, and that can work really, really well, being that they probably weren't training chest hard, weren't training arms very hard. And even the way they're going about things like back training, lower body training is a little bit different. And figure, they don't want as massive glutes, obviously, as compared to proportionally bikini or wellness or something like that as well. So form, address that first. And then I think from there, basically just start twice a week. And if you're looking at overall, the intensity question is no different than any other body part intensity, meaning hopefully, proximity to failure loads that you're using, same as anything else. Smaller body parts, sometimes the higher rep ranges can work a little bit better, just for sheer semantic reasons of how to progress loads. Again, being that whole thing, if you're trying to do sets of 6 to 8 and you're using 20 pounds on a cable, and the next jump that you have is 25 pounds, that might be a large percentage. So if you work in higher rep ranges, it can make for more manageable progressions, by progressing reps higher and then load. But some of that's just, again, that's not always like just the same for everybody across the board. So get your form fix first, slightly higher frequency from there. And then same as everything else, proximity to failure depends more on how long you've been training. And as far as volume, overall volume goes, same as every other body part. Start with as little as possible to see if you can produce results. And then, like the whole example I just gave on the last question about volume, maybe if you're pretty advanced and you're doing all the other stuff you need to do, then maybe look at more volume. Last question. This is kind of a cool question. Basically, a question saying, how should you train if you don't have a specific goal? I'm going to read some of this just so people can get the context of it. So they said, should I train more conjugate, powerlifting, which is powerlifting, bodybuilding, and then basically said they want to have, so you do have a goal. So here's a little bit of your goal. As you said, you want to have a decent level of fitness. I'd be interested in how you qualify or quantify that. Above average, get strong, build some solid muscle, look good naked, be healthy, and most importantly, become the best version of myself and find peace, and don't look for the perfect program every week. So a lot going on here, which is why I like the question, but some people were interested in the answer as well too, so I'm going to answer it. So to do this, a couple things at a time, you're going to have something as a baseline. So some baseline movements. It doesn't have to be a baseline workout. It doesn't have to be a baseline program, but find some movements, and they can be based off of kind of this patterny thing, which I don't think is a bad thing, but have some sort of baseline press. Doesn't have to be a bench press. Have some sort of baseline pull. Could be any type of pull down, row, whatever. Maybe have some sort of baseline deadlift variation, have maybe some sort of baseline squat pattern. We could go into more movements from there as well too. I mean, you can do the same, obviously, if we're looking at isolating biceps, triceps, whatever. But because you said strength is one of your goals, the very definition of strength is you have to have some metric to look at and actually say, am I strong? Strong, again, is a completely relative thing. So I'm assuming you're saying strong relative to yourself. Are you getting stronger? Are you stronger, hopefully, than you were 10 years ago? Have something to compare to. So I'd find some exercises that seem to fit you well, that are in those patterny type things. And I would track them still. I mean, based on your goals here, at the end of the day, you still have to log and track something. It just doesn't have to be something necessarily you have to do the same way every single workout, every single time. And I say make sure it's stuff that fits and feels good, because you have no desires to compete as a power lifter. You don't have to do, a deadlift, conventional deadlift. You don't have to do a bench press. And that lends itself too right into this whole muscle building thing as well, where if you have some of these bigger movements that fit well, they don't hurt your joints. Not only will those be good metrics that you can look at for seeing, is your strength progressing, or are you getting stronger, or at least maintaining strength, they'll also be things that will be good for growing muscle, because things that don't wreck your joints are going to be some of the best things that you can have for growing muscle. Outside of that, I mean, I would definitely have something that's maybe has a cardiovascular component in there as well too. So every human being should be doing some form of cardio in some way, shape, or form, I think, to be as healthy as possible. But also, you said you want to be fit. Most people are going to have some component of cardio in there. If you want to be fit, maybe you want to do something outside of the whole training thing that you base as your metric of fitness on there. So that could look something like, playing a sport, running around, playing pickup with your kids, or just playing pickup sport with your buddies, whatever that looks like. So I would have some sort of cardio component in there as well too. And most people are also going to have some component of, basically flexibility in there too. As a bare minimum, whatever you have available now for this range of motion, being able to move, most people want to maintain that, or if possible, expand that. And some people think, it's not that important. Well, if you look at how most people are when they're 80 years old, most people just stop doing things that require them to go where they're capable of going at some point in life. And if you don't go there, it's the silly saying, if you don't use it, you lose it. But that is accurate. So just having something as a bare minimum, and again, most people when they're in their 20s or their 30s or their 40s even, don't really think about that stuff. I don't really think about anything like being able to stand up tall. I don't really think about being able to lift things off the top shelf. I don't really think about being able to stand on one foot and actually have balance. But all those things I just mentioned when you're in your 70s or your 80s are sometimes the difference between being able to function or having to get one of those little pincher claw things to get things off the top, or the difference between you falling over and breaking your hip or being able to stabilize and balance yourself. And so again, that's maybe a little bit off topic, but not really. I mean, I think you should have more and more things in your programming that you think, all right, I want to be feeling good, moving good, looking good for a long period of time. More people do need to incorporate that stuff. So to sum all this up, this sounds like a good program maybe I should make. I just want to be a badass human, right now, and a badass human, when I'm 40, when I'm 60, when I'm 80. So I would have basically something in the gym that I would probably go with, a bigger type movement thing. I honestly just come back realistically to like a push-pull lower, so some sort of push-pull lower variation. If you're a normal person, I think that's a really good way to be able to train your whole body. Only have to train 3 times a week if you want to. Assuming that you're going to be slightly more advanced, there's nothing wrong with doing a half body or total body. I think that's kind of splitting hairs. You could arguably have that little higher frequency would be good. But saying that you want to look good, I think this would allow for some little bit more kind of like a bodybuilder style training to be in there as well too. A little bit more volume allocated to smaller stuff. Part of looking good is I want arms, I want cap delts, maybe you want calves. When you get into total body stuff, it can sometimes be hard to get that in. So I would do a program that involves some sort of active warm up for 5 minutes, like some of the stuff that I do. So over the course of a week, you're taking every joint in your body actively through its full range of motion. I would train some big movement, 1 or 2 big movements for each pattern. So I would have, again, if it was maybe my pull day, I would have a big pull movement, like a row or a pull down. I would have a big deadlift variation that I keep in there. I would do a couple movements, so maybe 1 or 2 movements there, maybe another 2 or 3 movements, kind of more of a purely bodybuilding style, where I'm having, again, isolated work for biceps, for delts, whatever it is. I would incorporate some cardio within that same session, because realistically, everything I just outlined shouldn't take more than maybe 40, 45 minutes, if that. So I would incorporate maybe probably different things on every session, maybe working in a different energy system. So I'd probably have some cardio for 20 to 30 minutes of steady state. I'd probably have some cardio of more of like a hit nature at some point in time there as well too. I would probably do some cardio that's maybe enjoyable, doing some sort of activity sometimes, maybe like playing a sport or just something else. And then I would incorporate some sort of, again, active, flexibility type thing where you're actively taking yourself into ranges of motion to finish your session, and probably train those areas, doing maybe some isometrics and stuff. And again, that little asterisk on that, my mobile meathead type thing kind of outlines exactly that kind of stuff that I want to do. I do most of that stuff 90% of the time. I skip on the stuff at the end of sessions sometimes because I'm lazy. But if I was really, really on top of my shit and just wanted to function well, I would do all the stuff at the end of the session as well too. So maybe that'd be a cool program. Maybe I'll design that at some point in time. You guys can all wait for that. Be very excited about that coming out at some point in time. But that's kind of how I would program it because I think that's kind of a cool question. And hopefully that kind of answers it. Maybe yes, no, sort of a little bit. But anyway, that is it. I think that was 9, 10 questions. Good questions this time. I enjoyed them. I thought they made me think a little bit, and some of them were a little bit different. Like that last question is a pretty cool question as well too. So if you guys haven't already, don't forget to ask questions if you want to ask. Get down in there and give those little thumbs up and maybe get your question or someone else's question answered. Maybe thumbs up your own question. That's a good idea. When you ask a question, make sure you thumbs up your own question. At least get it a head start. Maybe someone else will think it's a good idea to do too. And as always, don't forget to do the YouTube thing. If you haven't already, please like, subscribe, share with some friends. And until the next time, we'll come back where you guys will be 7. We'll be on to chapter 7. I can't believe it. Until the next one, guys, peace.